So having looked at the three premises, the universe had a beginning, the beginning event was caused, the cause for the beginning event was personal, you still might be a little bit leery about talking with people about this because they might come up with questions or objections. So what I've done is I put together a list of objections that people have and put them in a package so that we can prepare you for at least dialoguing about these. So we want to enable you to dialogue about some common objections related to the Kalam cosmological argument. There are some very sophisticated arguments that people bring forward about why you shouldn't believe it. Again, we're going to leave that to another session or another video series because most of the time you won't run into those. And I'll be honest, none of them are really that worthwhile to discuss in some sense. They're very esoteric. They are usually about speculative, really meaning scientific theories without any evidence behind them, but we still want to address them. Again, that'll be done in a separate video. So this is the common objections we'll talk about. When dialoguing with people, we're going to formulate this in a way that Greg Koukl suggests in his book Tactics. He does give some general guidelines for dialoguing with people, and let's just go through those first. The first one is never make a frontal assault on a superior force. If you're a student, you don't want to get into an argument with your professor. He's a superior force, you aren't. But you can dialogue with him, right? So instead of getting in an argument, which is a frontal assault, you can control the conversation. That's what we mean by guidelines for dialoguing. Never make a statement when you can ask a question that produces the same intent. So we want to get people to think, and you get people to think not by making statements, like I believe this. You get people to think by asking them questions, because guess what? Questions require a response, and people need to think about the response. You can control the situation by doing that. When somebody gives you an explanation, ask yourself first, is it possible? Is it even logically possible? Are there any contradictions in it? The second, is it plausible? And there may be several explanations that are plausible. And of the several explanations that are plausible, you want to select the ones that are most probable. So possible, plausible, probable. Remember, the burden of proof is the responsibility of the person to defend or give evidence for their view. By asking questions, you're placing the burden of proof on the person who's made a statement. And we'll see that here. When the other party makes a claim, make them defend it. Don't let them get off easy. They need to give you their argument with supporting evidence. If there's no supporting evidence, it's just opinion. And if it's just opinion, it's irrelevant. I also want to point out, I just saw a story is not evidence. Usually when we start talking about these things, people start going into a chain of explanations that require one explanation after another, after another, after another, after another. And these are just called just so stories. Stories are not evidence. Evidence would be historical facts, scientific facts, philosophical facts. So don't just accept a story. Do follow Greg Koukl's Colombo pattern he has in his book Tactics. Step 1, determine what the other person believes. Step 2, get the reason for their belief. And step 3A, use a question to show the view is self-defeating. Step 3B, take the point to its absurd conclusion. And step 3C, use questions to point out weaknesses. So do step 1, step 2, and one of the step 3s. There is a video series that talks about dialoguing in a way that you aren't embarrassed about your faith. You may want to go and check that out where we elaborate on these. But now we're just going to talk about how to dialogue with topics related to the Kalam cosmological argument. Someone may say the Kalam cosmological argument has been refuted. Well, you want to respond with a question. In what way has it been refuted? And usually when people make a statement like that, they've read it on the internet. And what you have to do is get at their source, make them think, is their source trustworthy? So you ask, in what way has it been refuted? Did you read that on the internet? Which is kind of embarrassing because everybody knows that what you read on the internet is not really that trustworthy unless it comes from a source that is reputable. Have you taken the time to understand the argument, or are you just taking someone else's word for it? And usually when somebody makes a statement like that, they don't understand the argument. As we've seen, there are lots of nuances to this argument, and the person just may not have read it. They may have read it, not understood it. They may have read somebody's interpretation of it, which is a straw man argument, and they refute the straw man. You may want to get more specific and say what part of it has been refuted, just to see if they really know what they're talking about. Now, this is one that I've seen, and I'll be honest, someone will say William Lane Craig is a bad philosopher and a liar. Okay, so when someone says that, they're just an idiot. I have no other way to describe it. They're just an idiot. William Lane Craig is a very good philosopher. I've read a lot of his material. I've read not only his, let's call them his popular books, I've read his academic literature. Very good philosopher. And he most certainly is no liar. He is more, and when he looks at his opponent's arguments, he gives them more credit than I would. He is much more generous. So when somebody says that, they're just an idiot. If you may just not want to even waste your time because they're so far down the rabbit hole that it's hard to see if you can even dialogue rationally with somebody like that. But if you want to, don't make a statement back. Don't get angry. Respond with what? Respond with questions. So, you say, aren't you promoting the genetic fallacy? The genetic fallacy is something is bad because of what originated it. So even if William Lane Craig is a bad philosopher and a liar, how does that make the Kalam cosmological argument wrong? You get back to the argument. What is wrong with the Kalam cosmological argument? You can say what part of his philosophy is bad. What items do you think he's lying about? You're asking for more detail here. You can ask, have you actually read his material? Not what somebody said about him? Or is that a professional philosopher's opinion or a layperson's opinion? I've read some of this, and it is usually a layperson who doesn't know what the heck they're talking about. This is like somebody criticizing a neurosurgeon who plays the doctor game. Anyway. 3 is they might say, I don't believe in God. Well, you could say, what do you mean by God? Because people have different versions of God. There's the God who created everything. There's the Old Testament God, and then there's Jesus. They may believe in a New Age God or something of that sort. So when they say, I don't believe in God, make them think about it. You can say, is that a personal opinion or something you think is objectively true? I don't believe in God, but you might. Does that mean it's an opinion? Do you have any proof for that belief? If they don't believe in God, what's the alternative? Well, the other alternative is an eternal universe. You could ask, do you believe in an eternal universe? And then they got a problem because if they say they believe in an eternal universe, well, what do you ask next? You ask, well, you believe in the Big Bang? Or they may say, well, I believe in the multiverse. Well, then the question is, well, do you believe in an eternal multiverse? Because they still have the same problem. Because the multiverse had a beginning. Or you could ask, what evidence do you have that God doesn't exist? And say 4, religion is for people who are weak. You ask, well, why do you think that weak people mean God doesn't exist? How do you get from weak people to God doesn't exist? It may be that there are weak people who believe in God, and it may also be that God does exist. Science has proven you don't need God. Well, why do you believe that? Because I've heard it's the opposite. When somebody says science is proven, you say, well, how has it proven that? That's a good question. What are the specifics that show it's proven that there is no God? Science is based on facts, while religion is based on faith. Now, this is actually a very naive view of science. Science does require faith, but people tend to think that it's only religion that requires faith. Well, we don't want to get into that. You can say, what if scientific facts could be used to point to the existence of God? You go into the Big Bang or the entropy, right? Here's one I've heard. Entropy doesn't apply to an open system. What they mean by that is, you could have, let's say, 2 rooms. Theoretically, you could have heat from one room flow into another room and warm up the second room. And they would try to say that, well, if you're talking about the entropy part of the universe had a beginning, maybe the entropy flowed from one universe to another universe, and that's why we had such a high amount of entropy. But we're not talking about 2 rooms. We're talking about the entire universe, everything. When you think about your refrigerator, normally things warm up, but in a refrigerator, what you're doing is you're making the inside of the refrigerator colder. So people would think, well, that's actually reversing entropy. But it isn't, because you have to look at the compressor on the refrigerator. So what's happening is the compressor is exchanging heat for coldness by adding energy. And when you look at the entirety of the refrigerator, not just the part that's cold, but also the compressor, you see that entropy is decreasing. So isn't the universe a closed system, not an open system? Then why wouldn't the entropy argument apply? You could ask, who caused God? Now, this is what's called a category mistake. It's a logical fallacy. And you could try to illustrate this because you say, are you asking what caused the self-existent uncaused cause? So it's kind of a nonsense question. You're asking what caused something that's uncaused. You could also try, are you asking why doesn't the being that is transcendent and uncaused need a cause? Again, why does an uncaused thing need a cause? Well, by definition, it doesn't. So you could ask, does that question make sense? Because it really doesn't make sense. Here, you can say, there's a physicist who says the Kalam argument is wrong. Physicists may be able to do math well, but they're very bad at logic. So if a physicist says the Kalam argument is wrong, you have to ask yourself, what does a scientist know about logic? May do math well, but you can say, what is their justification for saying it's wrong? Just sort of bypass the argument from authority and say, why do they think it's wrong? One of the things our culture has is it has this obscenely ridiculous high view of scientists. Whatever a scientist says is obviously true. It's almost like what you read on the internet has to be true. Well, we've got to bring that down. I'm a scientist, and I think what some scientists say is just ludicrous. So you want to ask, do you think physicists are infallible? Like, why is this physicist so much better at reasoning than philosophers who are paid to reason? Now, there are bad philosophers too, don't get me wrong. 10 says, if virtual particles can pop into existence from nothing, then why can't the universe? So there is a model of reality where in the vacuum of space, you have what are called virtual particles that pop into existence and pop out of existence. That's why they're called virtual. They don't hang around. And the way I view this, again, I'm not a professional physicist, but the way I view this is in space, unoccupied space where there's no matter, there's an energy density. And so in a volume of space, there's a certain amount of energy. And Einstein told us that E equals mc squared, so energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. So there's a relationship between energy and mass in that they can move back and forth. That's why we have nuclear bombs. And that you can have some energy which could spontaneously convert itself into mass, which would be virtual particles. And then those virtual particles convert themselves back into energy. So there's this sort of flux going on in the vacuum. Well, you want to ask a question to this. You say, don't virtual particles pop into existence because there's energy in a vacuum? Do you call that energy which is in the vacuum nothing? Remember, a vacuum is not nothing. A vacuum has dimensions, length, width, and height. It has energy, density, which means it has energy. So a vacuum is not nothing. The other thing is you could ask, how long do virtual particles exist? Because virtual particles pop into and out of existence, and their actual lifetime is dependent upon the energy level that they represent. So if you were to think of the universe as a virtual particle, it is a tremendous amount of energy, so it should have popped into existence and popped out of existence. So you want to ask, how long do virtual particles exist? 11. I don't know how God could create the universe, so I can't accept the Kalam. I think the person doesn't understand God, or they may have a different view of God, because you can ask a question, if God is omnipotent, then why can't he create the universe? And digging under this, you might ask, how can you, a finite being, expect to understand how an infinite being could create everything unless he told you? This is sort of a statement of ignorance. I don't know how it was done, so I can't believe it was done. Well, but why could you ever expect to conceive of how God could do this if God is so much smarter than us? I can't expect to do the math that Einstein did because Einstein was smarter than me. I wouldn't just stumble upon it. Now, if Einstein taught me, I could learn it. Number 12, cosmologists have put together a variety of cosmological models, and none of them have a need for God. Now, this is true. Cosmologists have put together a variety of ways to describe reality, and none of them have a need for God. But there's a slight problem in that many of those models, according to the BVG theorem, don't work. So you can ask, looks like I had a cut and paste here. Sorry. Let's skip that one. I don't think there is evidence for God. Well, did you know science provides evidence for the existence of God? This next one is a statement about a misunderstanding that you see a lot on the internet, where people don't distinguish between an actual infinite and a potential infinite. And they don't distinguish between what can exist in mathematical theory and what can exist in reality. Remember, we can imagine things that don't really exist. Like I can imagine a unicorn, but unicorns don't exist. And so somebody might say, modern mathematical set theory shows that infinite things can exist, like the integer numbers. Well, you can ask, how does existence in the mathematical realm prove existence in the physical realm? And you might want to get them to distinguish, is this an example of an actual infinite or a potential infinite? The person may not know the difference. And the 15 is along the lines. If I can split something in half an infinite amount of times, so it isn't true that an infinite can't exist. This is like Zeno's paradox. You want to ask a question back. Is there a physical limit to how many times something can be split? 15 is really a mental projection of taking a distance and cutting it in half, cutting it in half, cutting it in half. But that mental projection may not happen in reality. Is there an actual physical limit to how many times something can be split? And I believe there is. You can pick it out, but Planck time times the speed of light, I think, gives you the smallest measurable distance it's possible. So it's actually sort of a quantum distance unit in reality. You could ask, is this an actual infinite or a potential infinite? Is infinity actually ever reached? So this is really a potential infinite, not an actual infinite. Does this assume that any distance is composed of an infinite amount of sections? Which is begging the question. This is something William Lane Craig points out, is that in some ways, to state that you can split something an infinite amount of times is not proof you can do that. You're begging the question because your assertion contains your conclusion. 16. How can God cause the Big Bang if time didn't exist? Well, William Lane Craig points out that causes and effects can be simultaneous. You can ask the question, can a cause be simultaneous with its effect? If you think about a bowling ball sitting on a cushion and pressing down the cushion. Well, the bowling ball pressing down on the cushion is also simultaneous with the cushion being indented. Could the instant that God caused the Big Bang be the instant of the occurrence of the Big Bang? So not necessarily saying that you can have something simultaneous again. If you say infinite things can't exist, then how can God exist if he is infinite? This is a common problem where people use the same word with different meanings. And the word infinite here is used with different meanings. You want to ask a question and bring this out. You can say, is the argument that an infinite amount of things can exist in the Kalam? Is God a collection of an infinite number of things? Well, God is not a collection of an infinite number of things. Another question brings this out, which is, when God is described as infinite, is that a qualitative or quantitative sense? So we talk about the universe, we talk about a quantity of things in the universe. We talk about God, we talk about qualitative aspects of his existence. 18 is similar to one we talked about. The universe is just a big virtual particle. You can ask, in what ways is the universe like and unlike a virtual particle? So whenever somebody says the universe is like a big virtual particle, or something is like something, you want to bring out how is it like it, but also how is it unlike it? Because emphasizing the characteristics that are similar without looking at the characteristics that are different is prejudicial. Truth can only be proven by science. Well, you can ask, is that a scientific statement? Because that statement contradicts itself. It's self-defeating. What was God doing before time was created? This is what St. Augustine had to deal with. He said, is it possible? And William Lane Craig posits that God exists in a undifferentiated time sort of dimension, where there's no such thing as seconds, hours, and minutes. There are other possibilities too. You can ask, is it possible that God, prior to creation, existed in an undifferentiated time in which hours, seconds, days, and so forth simply do not exist? 21. You believe in a God of the gaps, sort of an accusatory statement. Well, what gaps do you think God is used to explain? Can you give me examples? And when people levy that sort of accusation against you, it means they feel they're losing and they're backed in a corner. So don't give up. Ask them for more detail. God wouldn't have done it that way. This is interesting. And I see how there's arguments for, quote, bad design in nature and that God wouldn't have done it that way. Well, why can't an omnipotent, omniscient, willful being choose to do things that are inefficient? When we look at a design, we say, well, God couldn't have done it that way, because a design in nature, God couldn't have done it that way because it's inefficient. But what does inefficiency mean to a being that can create everything, that has no power source or worries about running out of energy? Or where does the Bible say that God didn't do it that way? Because we want to defend the Christian God, not the God that people say, well, God is not inefficient. 23. Some or one of the scientific models will eventually fit all the data, thereby removing God completely from the best explanations. So this is not uncommon. And another way of saying this is, well, science will eventually provide us an answer. That's another way of making this statement. Well, what does this mean? Well, you can say, I guess you admit you don't have an explanation for the current data. Well, what they just admitted was they don't have an explanation, but they have hope. Hope is a bad strategy. You could ask the question, isn't that the ad futurist fallacy? Believe what I say because it will eventually be shown to be true. Continuing with the same one, where the person says, eventually science will answer this. Yes, you could ask the question, aren't you making a huge leap of faith here? Because they are. This is where they're making a faith statement. Let's just point that out to them. Now, importantly, if you follow what's going on, what you see is that there are more strange scientific models being posited to try and get away from the notion of a beginning event. And these models are getting more and more different from one another. So it's not as if people are converging or agreeing on a single approach. So you want to ask, shouldn't the scientific models be converging? Don't we see a proliferation of more and more diverse naturalistic models? If we believe that science is going to give us an answer, then we should see things becoming the same, converging on one way, one description, one explanation, but we don't. Here's another one. Stephen Hawking or some other scientist says philosophy is useless and dead. We could ask, is that a scientific statement made by a scientist? Is it a scientific statement that philosophy is useless and dead? You could ask, is that an opinion, or did he give appropriate justification for such a generalization? Imagine a philosopher saying science is useless and dead. Well, you'd immediately want to know, why would you say that? What's your justification? Well, if a scientist says philosophy is useless and dead, let's put it back on him and say, what's your justification? You could also ask, what philosophy has Stephen Hawking studied to reach that conclusion? If you're going to say philosophy is useless and dead, surely you should have read some philosophy. If you're going to make a generalization like that, you'd want to have read a lot of philosophy. And you could also ask, why should you or I accept that conclusion, that philosophy is useless and dead? Give me a reason. If Stephen Hawking said it, well, he's a scientist. Why should I believe him? If he were to talk about black holes, okay, he's a world-recognized leader in black holes. But philosophy? So in a summary of Dialog with the cosmological argument, never make a statement when you can ask a question. And when the other party makes a claim, make them defend it.